Now, the drug Ivermectin will no longer be legally prescribed to COVID-19 patients. The South African Health Products Regulatory Authority says there's no credible evidence that it helps treat the viral disease. For more on this, I'm joined now by CEO of the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority, Dr. Boitumelo Semete-Makokotlela. Very good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for your time. In January of last year, Ivermectin was authorized for usage. And all of a sudden, there's been a change of heart. What happened?
No, thank you for having me on the show and also to the public so we can explain what has transpired. So when we authorized the access to Ivermectin, which was at the time not registered for indications of management of COVID-19, it was during the time when we had limited therapies in the country to utilize for the management of COVID. But in addition, it was at a time where we had what we call clinical equipoise, wherein in essence what it means is that there was insufficient evidence to say that this is a drug that is effective against the COVID-19 and also insufficient evidence against its lack of efficacy or safety. And based on the fact that we had limited therapies, we then said this drug would then be made available under a controlled program so that as a regulator we can know who is bringing it into the country, who is then utilizing, and how are the patients then responding to that. Since then, we have been reviewing data that has emerged across the world, and based on the most recent sets of data that we have looked at, clinical trials conducted in the UK, in Israel, and in Malaysia, and many other countries, it's clear that this drug does not have clinical benefit. So for us as a regulator, we're saying, while this drug is not registered, we have looked at all of this data, which is what we had indicated, and it's not demonstrating the clinical efficacy that is required. So what this means is that we have not authorized this drug for the management of COVID as a regulator. However, because we do have a topical formulation for another indication that has been authorized, what it means is that if a healthcare professional does prescribe this product when it is compounded by those pharmacies that can compound, the responsibility and the onus of the patient safety squarely lies on the medical doctor, because they would be cognizant of the fact that they're now prescribing a drug that the regulator has certainly said it's not approved for management of COVID. So the active itself, unlike when we had the situation last year, has now been registered for human use. At the time, it was also not registered for human use. So a lot has happened in this period.
Surely this must set a dangerous precedent, though. I mean, looking at how serious COVID-19 is and how much hesitancy there's been and a lot of speculation about what works and what doesn't, this must really not sit well with a lot of people.
So, I mean, it is expected, particularly when we're dealing with a new disease, right, that you would have, and we saw this with COVID. We had emergence of different variants of concern. We had drugs that were being repurposed, that based on initial data, there was an expectation that these drugs would be effective, but once they are being applied to a broader population group, you see that the efficacy is not to the same extent. So I think we need to accept the uncertainty that comes with responding to a pandemic, at this point. But with time, we start to generate certainty. So, what I would say to the public is, it is important that whatever treatments are taken, whatever vaccines are taken, they need to be authorized by the regulator. Because what we do is we hold the manufacturers and industry accountable to ensure that that drug continues to do what it claims to do, but also that it's safe. And when it's not safe, there must then be clear recourse and clear risk management practices in place.
How did you come as an authority to allow the use of this drug? Did you approve it for usage before you found out the more detailed research around it?
Sure. So this controlled access program, it's not a new program really that we applied. We've applied it in the past. When we were dealing at the height of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, when new drugs were still being developed. So it is expected that, as you're dealing with a certain disease at its infancy, you will look at different mechanisms available at the time to enable access. However, the critical thing is that it must be controlled. You must make sure that the product that is being available in the market is a quality product, so that we don't deal with falsified and substandard products, but also that those who are then prescribing it can give you the feedback to say, is it giving you the required efficacy and is it safe? So this is a mechanism that is available to all of us as regulators. So at the time, we made this available because there were limited therapies, but also that we were in this position wherein there was insufficient evidence to say it is effective, but also there was insufficient evidence that would say it is completely not effective. And hence we said we will continuously review the data that would be generated across the world.
Don't you think that this perhaps sets a bad precedent on the consumer, in the consumer's mind, with the work that you're tasked with doing when you come back with research that was not even detailed enough for the approval of such a product?
Yeah, I think certainly not. I would actually say the public should actually be comfortable with the regulator being at a point where they say, based on the data that we have now, we are able to say that this drug is not effective. And at the time, we had indicated that, as I said, there was a clinical equipoise, and we say we're giving controlled access. So it wasn't available to everyone and anyone. It had to be available per prescription. So you would have had to consult with your healthcare practitioner. They would have had to give a prescription and give us as a regulator feedback. So the controlled mechanism there, the public must be cognizant of that. It wasn't a free-for-all, right? And hence now we say, after considering all the data, the reports that we've gotten, from making this available through this program, we are then saying it doesn't give us the clinical efficacy that we want. We had the same with hydrochloroquine early in the pandemic. We've seen, some of the results with drugs such as remdesivir, etc. It is expected that as you're dealing with the pandemic early on, there's just so much uncertainty, but you need to, as a regulator, ensure that you provide controlled access to a range of therapies.
What components, Dr. Boitumelo, may have influenced your decision prior to you now putting it aside under controlled access? What exactly does Ivermectin do?
So, at the time, and this was based on some antiviral properties that the drug was seen to have, and that it would be a broadly acting antiviral drug. And it's based on that early data, and we were saying that the data, while it was there, it was not strong enough. But also the data that was saying no was also not strong enough. So typically what you do is you would do clinical trials. This is what happens all the time. And I think I really need to stress this to the public, that there's nothing new with this mechanism. It happens all the time. Drugs are being repurposed. Drugs are being evaluated under controlled clinical trials. That's why we need clinical trials, so that we generate more data. So it was still at an early phase. And hence at the time we said, let's make it available under a controlled mechanism. But now that there's data from properly designed clinical trials, we can then say with certainty that it does not have the required clinical efficacy. Also, for those who were proponents of this drug early on, we've seen that the studies that they relied on have been retracted by credible institutions. And so our position is corroborated by the WHO, which has taken a similar position. The US FDA has also taken a similar position. And so, it is typical of dealing with the pandemic.
So what does this mean now for health facilities who may have stocked this product in bulk?
Sure. So we have records, right, of all of that. So we know which facility has authorization. We know which healthcare professionals have. And I must say, in the last 6 months, we actually have not received much applications, so that we know that the stock that was approved at the time has either run out or is running out. And those individuals have then the authorization, right? And as we've said, the healthcare professionals that we've given authorization for, they've had to apply for a specific patient, a specific dose, and they would monitor that patient. Again, this was not a drug that was to be available free for all. It had to be under a controlled mechanism. And so we know all of that. And so we know, as we said, there's very little stock of ivermectin that should be available in the country based on the records that we have and the facilities that we have authorized.
I don't know if you answered my question about its uses, its initial uses. What is it used for? If I have bought or had a doctor prescribe me some of the ivermectin, am I now to throw it in the bin because it is of no use to me?
So had you received it on a prescription, you would have had a dose that by now would have been finished, because it was supposed to be for yourself for a very specified time, and it would be quantities for that time. So no one, if it's availed properly, should be sitting with excess ivermectin because it's supposed to be on a prescription.
Very well. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for weighing in on this discussion. Dr. Boitumelo Semete-Makokotlela, CEO of the South African Health Products Regulator. Ivermectin no longer allowed to treat COVID-19 in South Africa.